Now going back to our main topic, which is insider-outsider theory, we would like to give the mic over to you, Professor Turner.
I think that often it's easier to understand what a person's saying when you know to some extent where they're coming from. And this whole topic today started at a conference in Bochum in Germany, where a young, rather aggressive man from New York stood up and kind of complained that I was old, grey, masculine, heterosexual, and arrogant, and lots of other things. In other words, my positionality presented a problem in ever talking about Islam. As it turned out, the young man was white, masculine, heterosexual, and so forth. So, and my reply to him was a little bit rude, and I won't repeat it, but I mean, it was to say to him that if we're going to sort of have any social relations, then there must be some level where people in different positions can communicate with each other. And in highly diverse societies, that must be a possibility. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see how we could have societies in which we all lived in. And I think if there's any philosophers here, I'm probably going to get the idea wrong, but it's a bit like Leibniz's windowless monad, you know, that we have to have some capacity for understanding the other. Anyway, when I was preparing this lecture, it suddenly struck me what an odd word understanding is. Why not overstanding or bystanding or superstanding or something? So I began to kind of read around understanding, and it has a kind of very ancient sort of English and German origin, and it's worth kind of looking at it because, I mean, the alternative meaning of understanding is to stand amidst or to stand in a state. So again, you know, the word understanding kind of brings us straight away into the insider-outsider problem. Is understanding standing literally from underneath, or is it standing in the midst and so forth? And what's germane to this particular talk is the idea, or the German notion of a stehen, or to stand in front of, in a sense. And this leads us straight into Max Weber, the German sociologist that is important in this talk, because Max Weber sort of defines sociology as what he called Verständigkeitssoziologie, in other words, understanding sociology, or and by that he meant that sociology is not so much concerned with external behavior, but must take into account the meanings that people attribute to other actors, to the meaning of actions, to objects, and so on and so forth. And so Weber's sociology of understanding was an attempt to sort of criticize positivism, if you like, namely that to really get to grips with something, you've got to get to grips with its meaning, and to be able to translate that into, you know, an adjacent language so that people can read across cultures. And I'll talk a little bit about Weber in a bit, because the irony that one of the ironies of Weber's sociology, that you might want to say that he profoundly misunderstood Islam. But his writing on China, Hinduism, Protestantism, and so forth has been constitutive of sociology, at least the sociology of religion, for a very long time. So this problem of understanding is actually fundamental to the sociological project, which is more than just behavioralism. It's an attempt to get to grips with what people mean by things. Well, let me start with a bit more context. I mean, this book I wrote in 1974, Weber and Islam, was the product of being a postgraduate student at the University of Leeds in England, where I had wonderful teachers. And again, you know, we could, you know, the older people in this group could spend a lot of time thinking about how teaching has changed. I mean, at ACU, I have no undergraduate students. In fact, I never meet students because I'm designated as a research professor. Whereas when I was an undergraduate, I met some of the most famous thinkers around, you know. I mean, the philosophers I had were leading, you know, Catholic thinkers, or, I mean, I had the best logician apparently in Britain as my tutor. He struggled desperately to get me to think logically. And then I had a wonderful teacher called Trevor Ling, who was a comparative teacher of religion. He'd been a Baptist minister in the British Army in India, got fed up with the Baptists and became a Buddhist, and then also became an Anglican priest and then a teacher of religion. So here I was with a guy who was really in search of the sacred, who was a Buddhist Anglican priest come academic. And so my answer to the young man that was challenging me as a white elderly male was, well, people occupy lots and lots of different positions simultaneously. I mean, I can say, I think one thing that's relevant is that my wife is Vietnamese. My child has an American passport, a British passport, an Australian passport, and a Vietnamese passport. So what's her position? So the idea that we can be locked easily into stationary positions must be something we have to reject, or at least critically look at for some time. And I think this experience of this man, Trevor Ling, was very significant in my development. I mean, not least of which because one day he said that Max Weber had written lots of short statements about Islam, but had never put it together as a book. And a little light went on in my head, and I thought, oh, this would be an interesting project to kind of pull Weber's stuff together. And I said, you know, a few minutes ago that Weber probably seriously misunderstood Islam. At least he fell into the conventional Western view that Islam was, quote, a warrior religion. And I mean, that ignores all sorts of things like the Sufi traders who took Islam to Asia, or the long tradition of civility in Islam that's not present in Weber's book. So, I mean, you know, understanding can easily become misunderstanding, and we might want to look further at that. But when I was writing this book, Weber in Islam, it was interesting. There wasn't really any sociology of Islam around in the English-speaking world. I mean, there was Maxime Rodin's work in France on the Prophet, and he wrote a book on Islam and capitalism, which influenced my work a lot. But we might want to talk about whether it's, I mean, I'm sure we will want to talk about whether it's secular sociologists can actually understand the Prophet or Jesus or the life of the Buddha and understand the meaning of that, since Rodin's argument was that the Prophet misunderstood the messages he was getting, and that the Quran was the product of the Prophet, not the literal words of God. So, I mean, you can see straight away a very fundamental clash here with the insider view of Islam. Now, another figure I want to mention, because I think he may well come up, is Talal Asad. I mean, when I was young, after writing this book, Weber in Islam, I became a member of what was called the Hull Group at Hull University, which was quite famous for its work on development. And Talal Asad was a young academic about my age, or a little bit older, at Hull. And we used to have meetings at Hull where we would debate the limitations of English Middle East studies. And Talal has kind of stayed in my life in various ways. He got me to review, I think this is one of the most wonderful books from an outsider, The Venture of Islam by Hodgson, Marshall G.S. Hodgson. And I was fortunate to be allowed to review the 3 volumes. I think I was too young to review it, but I reviewed it. And one of the issues I raised was that whilst Hodgson was extremely knowledgeable about and sympathetic to Islam, he wrote it from the position of a committed Quaker. And so, unlike Max Weber, I mean, Hodgson had a completely positive view of Islam as not a militaristic religion. And I think his work showed or developed the idea of Islam as a global universalistic faith that was refreshing at the time. This was 1978 or something like that. What Talal Asad and I have in common is a deep respect for the role of the body in religious systems. He and I both tend to think about religion as a life world based upon practices in which beliefs express those practices rather than constituting them. And you can't really understand religion simply as a set of beliefs. I mean, I think it's kind of characteristic of Western intellectuals, or perhaps intellectuals anywhere, that they hone in on belief systems because that's what they're used to studying. Unlike anthropologists, who I think get the message straight away. So my work is very much influenced by Mary Douglas, who I think got the point about, the body as a system of metaphorical propositions about belief systems and so on and so forth. And Talal Asad and I both published an article or a chapter in a book edited by Sarah Coakley, who happened to be the daughter of Mary Douglas. So this is why I keep going on about these connections. I think trying to understand religious leaders like Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, and so forth, is kind of the test case in a way of understanding other belief systems. Let me talk about positions of knowledge. Straight off, you might think that the insider view has it all over the outsider view. The insider views have historical knowledge, they have an upbringing, they have kind of an intimacy with a religious tradition that perhaps outsiders cannot get. But as I'll say shortly, I mean, one of the difficulties of the insider position is it typically becomes advocacy rather than analysis. And so I think there is a kind of problem there that we need to consider. And I gave you that paper of mine with Josh Roos on Islamophobia. And it was a bit of a naughty thing to do because I think it probably upset everybody. And so it should create some kind of discussion when we get to that stage. So insider views can become advocacy, whereas outsider views are often, critical and don't have the kind of intimacy that insiders have. But who are the insiders and the outsiders? Again, Talal Asad's personal life struck me as very interesting. He was born in Medina. I mean, what a place to be born. If you want to go on to be, so globally recognized as an authority. Then of course, his father was a Jew who converted to Islam. Talal was brought up in Pakistan. He was trained at Cambridge by Sir Evans Pritchard. And Talal, if you've ever heard him speak, has this wonderful plum BBC voice that I will never have because of my position, which was a working class lad from Birmingham. So I never really got the Cambridge voice. But Talal, I mean, what kind of position does Talal have? I mean, is he kind of very much the insider? Well, yes. But he's also very much the outsider, the upper class Western, anthropologist who is kind of alienated from anthropology because of its kind of problems in relation to religion. So, I mean, part of my issue is people's positions are very complicated. They change over time. And so what we might want to talk about is the idea of conversion. What happens if you convert to, as Talal's father did, convert to Islam? Are you kind of more on the inside than insiders? Or you can never actually escape? I mean, I reviewed a book recently by Jews who leave ultra-Orthodox Judaism. And the book was a study of New York Jews. And the argument of the book is that you never actually leave. You spend your entire life leaving, but you never get to an end state in which you say, okay, I've left, because you're so profoundly influenced by, you know, your mother's training, your upbringing. I mean, Talal goes on, you know, very poignantly about his mother's Arabic voice and, you know, listening to the Quran as a child and so on and so forth. So, I mean, can you ever leave a position? That's another kind of interesting issue that we might want to bring up. Or are converts more committed to the inside view than the insiders and so forth? So when I was writing this book, you know, the most influential writer about the inside-outside world is probably Edward Said's book on Orientalism, which has created a whole school of Orientalist critique. I'm sure there are societies, the Edward Said societies. I see adverts for their conferences and so forth. And as you know, I'm sure everybody in the room knows that Said was profoundly critical of Western views of Islam, including this one about the military history. The idea that Muslims are lazy, that's why they haven't had the economic success of the West, or that they're authoritarian, they don't make good Democrats, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we kind of know that very well now, but Edward Said's book was, number one, very well written. And if you want to be influential, it's, you know, having a well-written book is a good start. And, you know, I mean, Edward Said's critique, however, was mainly about English literature or literary fictional works. And he says virtually nothing about the social sciences. I mean, later on, I wrote this book, Marx and the End of Orientalism, in which I was kind of trying to probe some of the problems about Western social science, about other religions. And I mean, we are talking about Islam today. We could be talking about Buddhism or Confucianism or any other religion you'd want to mention. This is not stuck with it. What I forgot to mention was the kind of irony that sometimes outsiders can get a better insight into the inside world. And the example I give is the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, the book on democracy in America, which is probably one of the most famous books ever written about American democracy. And the irony, of course, is that de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat. And he went to France to understand, he went to America to understand France, not to understand America. And he keeps writing letters back to France saying, every time I go to an American town, I'm looking at France, because he wanted to understand what had gone wrong with the French Revolution and whether an American democratic revolution could be successful. Anyway, here's a very good example of an ironic outsider who writes one of the best books ever about American democracy, which virtually every American political scientist refers to still to this day. Where shall we go from here? My best examples of sympathetic outsiders about Islam are the Marshall G.S. Hodgson book, The Venture of Islam, and more recently, Armando Salvatore's wonderful Sociology of Islam, Knowledge, Power and Civility, in which Salvatore is particularly interested in the whole history of civility inside Islamic cultures and Islamic civilizations. So what I propose in this talk eventually is, a rather simple division perhaps between insider and outsider And then I have critical and sympathetic. So I end up with a kind of typology of sympathetic outsiders, critical outsiders, sympathetic insiders, and critical insiders, of course. And so I mean, this is another wonderful book. I mean, that I reviewed for the American Journal of Comparative Sociology. It's Mohammed Bamye's book, Life Worlds of Islam. And I'm very sympathetic to it because he says, you know, he starts off by saying basically that to understand religion, you've got to look at the life worlds of the people who are Muslims or Christians or Buddhists. I guess from my position, I also want to argue that beliefs are second order, and that may be offensive to theologians in the room, but it seems to me that from an anthropological and sociological point of view, we have to take practices extremely seriously. And that here again, embodiment is so important to the practices of religion. And we shouldn't sort of downplay that element of it. And in my own work around the body, I'm particularly interested in the notion of vulnerability. And vulnerability comes from the Latin to be wounded or vulnus, a wound or to be wounded. And so I treat human beings as wounded creatures whose embodiment presents them with profound, ongoing, constant challenges. One of the illustrations I have of vulnerability is toothache. And a political theorist read my book on vulnerability and said he'd never had toothache until he was 58 years of age. And therefore it wasn't that general or important. And I wrote back to him and said, yeah, that's a good critique, but I took my argument from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, in which he says he'd never met a philosopher who could tolerate toothache. And I replied that I took Shakespeare to be an authority on vulnerability, and I was going to stick with Shakespeare over my critic. But anyway, I think death is the best example of what I mean by vulnerability. And I think that the belief systems of, if we're going to understand religion, we have to come to terms with human vulnerability. And my argument would be that all major religions, including all philosophies, are ultimately about this one issue of the vulnerability of being in the world, and therefore the vulnerability that underlies religious practices and ultimately religious beliefs. And so, okay, let me begin to finish. I think I have about 15 minutes and then we can move on. You're going to tell me that Islam has become an object of hatred and indeed ridicule and so forth in the West. And you can trace it back to you can trace it back to at least the 17th century, when Protestant theologians thought Islam was just another sectarian movement within Christianity. And of course, since 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS, the wars in Syria and so on and so forth, I mean, the situation has become profoundly difficult. And that's why understanding Islam is of such major political and cultural and religious significance now. But I take the view that, unfortunately, as a sociologist, I see the whole of society as being bound up with in-groups and out-groups. And having lived in or worked in New York for about 6 or 7, 8 years or so, I mean, the conflict between white and black is far more profound, deep, and long-standing than any hostility towards Islam, despite 9/11 and all the rest of it. And of course, Muslims have been in America almost as long as the white settlers. So, I mean, it's not that, you know, Muslims suddenly turned up in America. They've been there all the time. But why the conflict between Christianity and Islam, which strikes me as strange, because I mean, I end this paper by talking about family resemblances. I mean, if you wanted to compare two religions that have so much in common, it would be Islam and Christianity, not Christianity and Buddhism or Confucianism or Zoroastrianism or anything else. It would be Islam. Why? Because we are people of the book. I don't believe, despite Muslim critique, that Christianity is polytheistic. I've never met a polytheistic Christian. We can debate that, but that would be my view. And it's a religion of prophet, religion of the prophet. It's a religion that has a deep sense of, again, the vulnerability of people, I think. And also, I mean, Christianity and Islam have been not so much in conflict, but if you look at the history of, you know, the south of the Iberian Peninsula, I mean, there you had a cosmopolitan world in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews got on very well, thank you. So given these family resemblances, I mean, it seems to me kind of rather odd that there would be this, you know, these tensions between Christianity and Islam. I'm not Catholic, but I'm in a Catholic university. And when I was appointed here, I said, you know, I mean, is there a problem that I'm not Catholic? And, you know, they went out of their way to say, you know, this is a modern university. We treat people of different faiths equally, and so on and so forth. And if there's difficulties of understanding Islam, there's difficulties about understanding religion generally. And again, I go back to where I started. If you're a secular sociologist, understanding the belief systems of Islam or any other religion presents you with problems. And therefore, sociologists tended to be more interested in the consequences of religion than what it is. I mean, take Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's not a study, well, I mean, it involves a study of Protestant theology, but it's really about the effects of Protestantism in Germany rather than anything else. Okay, I'm going to finish with a conundrum. I've been reading Sigmund Freud in order to come to terms with this lecture. And the consequence of Freud's psychoanalytic tradition is the more profound question, probably, can I understand myself? I'm an insider to myself, but having been around for 76 years, I've come to the conclusion, no, I don't understand myself. Therefore, perhaps I can't understand anybody else. I jokingly say to my wife who phoned me, I've spent a long time trying to understand you, but it's still a mystery. Okay, let me finish there. I don't know what you want to do next, whether you want a little break or people start asking questions. I've forgotten how you wanted to organize it. We've got quite a lot of time left, of course.
Thank you very much. Let's ask the audience if they need a few minutes for a tea break, they can grab their tea and come. Or if they want, when the debate is still, I think, fresh, we can just...
As a vulnerable human being, I've got a sore throat. Can I go and get a cup of tea and I'll be back in 2 minutes?
Yes. Maybe, yes, take your time for a few minutes. You can grab your water, tea, and in the meantime, yes. For those who stay, maybe, Züleyha, do you have interesting questions to the audience? Maybe we can ask. Maybe cats and dogs question. Do you want to ask anything about cats and dogs?
Now that you said cats, yeah. Okay, let's have some fun time. What do you prefer, cats or dogs? Let's see how many cat people there are and how many dog people. None? Okay, that's good. Got a few cats coming. Cats are the winners so far.
Thank you very much, Professor Respectable. You presented
Dr.
more
Said,
efficient.
he's just on break. He's gone to get tea, so he can't hear you. If you would like to wait.
Okay, okay, okay.
Neither. Someone wrote neither. Surely cats.
It's tricky if you ask those of us who with a Chinese background, because Chinese eat dogs.
Oh, dear.
Not here in Australia, but in other places.
Right.
You understand from liking, right?
So you kind of then says, do you like dogs, but with how much garlic, you know?
And as you would know, really, in the Australian culture, a dog is a man's best friend. So it really is a bit of a, a shift in thinking there. Adding a spanner to the works there for sure.
Hi.
Okay.
Maybe we should ask you, Ryan. Zuleha was asking a question. We should get your answer as well.
Yes, the key question that's been asked is, do you like cats more or dogs more?
That's
What?
a very good question. I have a border collie, which is basically a member of the family. Very much. I mean, my wife prefers the dog to me, and I don't blame her. I think that's a very good choice. I was once interviewed at the University of Durham, and at the end of the interview, the vice chancellor said, "Are you a cat man or a dog man?" And I said, "I'm a dog man." I didn't get the job, so obviously he was a cat man, I think.
Oh,
Anyway, there we go.
wow. Something to keep in mind.
I don't know. I make this comment. I lived in Singapore for about 5 years, and the Muslim community there refused to travel in taxis that had dogs in them. And here again is a good example of a practice that informs people's lives. Anyway.
Maybe how should we do? Or you can write your questions, and based on the traffic, maybe we can keep the session interactive. But please keep the questions concise and the comments concise, clear, and as I said, short, so that we have time for others as well. But in the meantime, if there is too much traffic, too much, I think, interest, we can maybe type in the meantime as well, so that we can catch all questions and comments. Who would like to go first?
I think Dr. Said had a question.
I have a question about Professor Bertner. Firstly, congratulations for presenting and conducting this important conference. I just have a question to Professor Bertner about Sigmund Freud. In which perspective mentioned you? Because being a researcher, I know that he has not any religion. Sigmund Freud, and he was atheist person. I just want to answer about Sigmund Freud.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, Sigmund Freud had no religion, is that what you're saying? And therefore you would have difficulty understanding religion. I didn't quite get what you wanted to say. I mean, Sigmund Freud took religion very seriously. I mean, that's why he wrote so much about it. And of course, I think most of his patients were Jewish women for most of his life. And so he was very much wrapped up in Jewish culture. And I think he was a profoundly Jewish thinker. I mean, and I say that as a compliment. I mean, and this is not a critique. I mean, I think he was, like a lot of Jewish intellectuals, a kind of very interesting thinker. and very serious. I mean, one of the guys that influenced me very much was Ernest Gellner, who was, again, secular, but he brought a kind of East European Jewish intellectual life to bear that was very, stimulating and influential. I mean, he was very much disliked by.
Oh, I have a question about in which perspective you mentioned Sigmund Freud in this presentation.
I wanted to end with a puzzle, because here we are talking about, can we understand Islam? Can we understand Buddhism? And we kind of need to challenge ourselves. I mean, can I understand myself? I mean, you might think that if there's an insider view of Brian Turner, it's Brian Turner. But I mean, I was kind of saying, well, for many people, I mean, their own personalities are a bit of a puzzle. I mean, we tend to think we're very nice, upstanding, clever, attractive people, but that may be the good news. I mean, not necessarily from an outsider perspective.
I have interested about this personality because I have already written a research paper about Sigmund Freud regarding dream psychology and dream interpretation.
Yes.
So in this way, I mentioned about Sigmund Freud.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not an expert on Sigmund Freud. I'm very interested. Well, not on the topic of vulnerability. I've written a lot recently about the notion of happiness, and I'm interested that most secular sociologists are more interested in failure and unhappiness than they are in happiness. And so I edited a book with some friends looking at various traditions about happiness. And I did read recently, and I've got the book on the table somewhere, that Freud himself was very deeply troubled by how could people have happiness. And I think the outcome of his psychoanalytic process was that he hoped to allow people to manage their unhappiness more successfully, but he didn't think he could offer them happiness. And I think that you could invite me back in about 12 months' time to talk about religion and happiness. It would be, I mean, again, I'm going off as a tangent. I mean, Max Weber was himself profoundly unhappy man. And I think that he was at one level, a Lutheran of all sorts. Someone's daughter is waving to you, Emre Celik, from behind your head. Anyway, daughters are very much welcome. So what about another question then?
Yes, Mehmet has a question. He was asking about the concept of life worlds. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sorry, can I just leave the thing for 1 second? Hello. Hello.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's difficult to stop phone calls. Sorry, what was the next topic?
Yes, just curious about the concept of life worlds.
Life world.
How does the author define it?
Oh, God. Sorry, I have to answer this. Sorry. Hello. Yeah, I'll call you back, but I'm in a lecture. It's taken essentially from the work of a German sociologist called George Simmel. And Simmel thought that sociology ought to be the study of these life worlds, which is basically what I'm trying to express by the idea of an ensemble of practices, that we live in a life world in which we are socialized into, bodily performance in various ways. I think so. I'm giving this idea of life world a strong kind of physical embodied kind of framework, because I'm trying to get by the tendency of sociologists in particular and philosophers to sort of home in on religious belief as though that was actually the whole deal. Whereas I think, religious people have ritualistic lives and civil lives and family lives, and this whole kind of collection of activity constitutes their life world. what they eat, what they dress, where they sleep, how they have their being, is, really, to get at religion, I think you have to get at that kind of idea. And I very much recommend this book by Bamier, Life, Wealth and Islam. My review starts by saying, this book is one which we academics wish we had written. So you couldn't have a better start than that. Okay.
Helen, would you like to ask your question directly? I think you typed it here. Helen, it was about...
Do you want me to read it?
Please, because I'm having difficulty with following.
No worries. In your typology, where would you put a senior secondary student, a Hindu, who is undertaking religious studies and comments to the teacher, what you're telling us about this religion bears no resemblance to my understanding, brackets, and implied practice life world, close bracket, of the Hindu religion. The teacher is an outsider, but using reputable studies of religion texts. This is data from some of the research I've been doing on teaching about Islam.
Yeah. I don't know. All I can say is that at the basis, to get an education, you have to open yourself to different views, different ideas, different practices. Otherwise, I can't see much point in an educational system. You don't have to believe what you come to understand. That may be another issue we have to look at. But going back to this Trevelyan, you see, I was very lucky to have a man who had started life as a Baptist minister, became an army chaplain, came to the conclusion that baptism was not a good form of Christianity, ended up his life as as I say, a Buddhist Anglican. And I think that, you see, what I didn't say in the lecture, but what is in the paper, is that most of us now live in highly complex cosmopolitan worlds, which are highly diverse. Australia is a very good example of this. It's a migrant society like America. And in order for this society to exist, there has to be kind of some, well, I'll say give and take. There has to be some kind of mutuality in which one listens sympathetically to others. And so all I can say is that the student doesn't understand what an educational opportunity is. Why study other religions if you are, completely locked into the world you live? The problem with cosmopolitanism is, one of the critiques of cosmopolitanism, and possibly a critique of me, is that we're everywhere and nowhere. One of the criticisms of liberal cosmopolitanism, I think, is it's a fine position for rich upper class or middle class people who can pick and choose their diversity. But I'm not going to be able to give a good answer to this question. I just feel sorry for the teacher and for the student, that the student at least is missing this wonderful opportunity to enrich his own life by looking at something else.
I think Helen has a comment. You can speak, Helen, yes.
Oh, thank you. And my apologies. I just couldn't seem to unmute myself. So thank you for your help. I think my point, I may not have made my point very well. My point was the textbook may have focused more on beliefs, whereas the student was talking about life, world, and practice.
Yeah. Okay, well, my answer...
I wanted to give that as a very real example of what you are arguing. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, my answer is a bit trite, which is that it's a very bad textbook. But that's not a very good answer. But that's why I get very annoyed with, well, sociologists or philosophers, anybody who pick on, you know, one single belief and say the whole religion is therefore, you know, erroneous or false or something silly. Because people, I don't know, I mean, people have complicated views anyway, but I mean, my own view, and I can't, you know, I keep saying this, it's as much to do with practice as anything else. And, you know, let me go to Mary Douglas. Mary Douglas was very critical of Vatican II because she said it had, you know, robbed Catholicism of its historic rituals by downgrading Fridays, for example, you know. So, I mean, Mary Douglas, who was, you know, a very serious anthropologist and a practicing Catholic, wrote wonderful books from a, you know, a kind of Catholic anthropology. I mean, she wrote, I don't know if you know this work. I mean, she wrote a wonderful book on Leviticus, which she thought was all about practices and so forth, you know. So, I mean, practicing Catholic anthropologists can say interesting things about practice and life worlds without, you know, having to sort of, you know, become committed to the theology that behind it. And I think, you know, theologians and Catholic priests have a kind of professional commitment to the beliefs, obviously, but I mean, they also kind of, I think, recognize that they're talking to people whose the practice of religion is, you know, their daily activity. I mean, Talal talks about his mother, you know, reading verses from the Quran every morning, and that struck me as, you know, profoundly important for her, but also profoundly important for Talal Assad. So, my mother, I mean, you know, no one has asked me yet if I'm if I practice religion, but you see, my mother was a spiritualist. And she claimed to be in touch with, you know, dead people. And there was a famous incident we were living in Aberdeen, Scotland. And when that famous oil rig went down, and I think sort of 60 men died underwater, and so they couldn't get the bodies back. And so the widows of these men were profoundly disturbed because they wanted to get the bodies back. And my mother became a kind of a pastoral counselor to these women, communicating with their husbands that they couldn't retrieve. So, I mean, I was brought up in, you know, a spiritualist environment. That must impact on me. I mean, I'm not sure how, but it must do, because that's you know, one more comment of a very personal nature. My mother had 2 pregnancies. The first one was stillborn, a little girl, and then me. And my mother always said to me that she could see my sister coming down the stairs in the house. So that was some experience. So I'm rambling on, as old people tend to, but I just think textbooks that are only about belief systems need a lot of kind of reworking. Of course, you know, I'm not saying the beliefs are totally irrelevant. I'm just saying it's only part of what it is to have a religious life, you know. So.
Thank you. I think Sarah has a question. Yes, Sarah.
Thank you, Professor.
Can you introduce yourself briefly before your question?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Professor Turner, for the presentation and everything. My name is Sarah Sheikh Hussein. I'm a PhD student at the end of my PhD at Deakin Uni, and my research is on Islamophobia, but I look exactly at countering responses by Muslim community organizations in the space. So the insider-outsider conundrum somehow applies to my research, and in terms of me being a Muslim woman, however, a migrant to this community, to the context of the Australian Muslims. So as a junior sociologist trying to unpack this phenomena of Islamophobia within a context that I'm too new to it. Like, this is not my area. This is not where I was raised. This is not the culture I belong to. However, I still belong to this group just for the fact that I'm a Muslim. So the insider-outsider conundrum applies to me as well as a person who's conducting that research. I was trying to form my question, listening to you talking about theology and practice, and your reply to Helen, and it always baffles me, the idea of outsiders researching theology of Islam, and then outsiders trying to understand Muslims within certain contexts, similar to what I've been trying to do. How do you define the outsider-insider relationship in terms of outsiders engaging in theological understanding or analysis of Islam, and then outsiders engaging in sociology and anthropology, trying to analyze practices of Muslims within different contexts, which I'm sure everyone agrees that they differ according to the context, the place, the time, and all the other elements that apply to it. Similar to some extent to the analysis of theology, which also differs according to which era you choose to explore the religion and the text at certain times in history. So I'm just interested to see how you reflect on these two elements of theology and sociology and the outsider-insider conundrum in that space.
Well, I think one of the problems in Muslim relations with, Australian or Western cultures, or one of the problems of Islamophobia is the assumption that Islam is a single integrated unit that has no internal diversity. I mean, we haven't spoken at all so far about Sunni Shia. I mean, just to mention one, differentiation, or that Christianity is a kind of unified block in some way. I mean, the differences between Protestant, Catholic, and Quaker, and Methodist, and so forth. I mean, is there a unified Christendom? Well, the answer is no, I think. And so, I mean, with the insider-outsider, I mean, it may be when I come to write this book that I have to kind of almost abandon the insider-outsider because it's sort of oversimplified, but it's not a bad way of hanging some arguments on that sort of paradigm. I guess outsiders that study, quote, other religions, I mean, must be taking those religions seriously, otherwise they wouldn't spend their academic careers, studying some other culture or the religion. So, I mean, again, I think that, and I could quote more. I think lots of outsiders have said some very interesting things about Islam, which might have been missed or, would not be obvious to insiders. And similarly, the way in which Muslims experience Christianity, I mean, sort of exposes blind spots of people who are, sort of insiders. As it turns out, if you look at the sociology of religion in America, particularly sociologists that study Catholicism, my experience is that most of them are Catholic. So, I mean, are they insiders with an insider point of view? I mean, I think Catholics studying Catholics might say, as I've said in this lecture, that they have a bit of a privileged access to what being a Catholic is like, whereas me, not being a Catholic, perhaps I miss some things that are important. But I mean, I tend to agree with, I mean, insofar as I have a view about Catholicism, I'm the same as Mary Douglas. I think Vatican II was probably a mistake. It robbed Catholicism of much of its historic ritual character. I mean, I agree with Vatican II, which sought to reach out to other religions and not to take a hostile view of other belief systems. And the Pope that we have has been remarkably outgoing. I mean, more than most popes in terms of his, his view of, refugees, just to mention one thing, and his view about, COVID-19 has been, very, very ethically sensitive to it all. So, I mean, I think that, and here again, I mean, Vatican II had some good things and some bad things, like most things in life. But I'm trying to make, I suppose I'm making the point that the inside-outside distinction is much more complicated when you get to it. And I mean, I'd have to go into more detail with you. I mean, you can email me. As you know, I mean, I was at Deakin for a long time, and I know most of the people there. So I'm not answering your question, but perhaps I can have another go at it another time.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions piling up, and I have my own waiting aside as well. Maybe if you can try to answer shortly so that we have time for other questions as well. I know these are ongoing discussions, we never will end, but it is a good start at least. And one of the questions is that you made a point that Islamophobia is an advocacy rather than and lacking a scientific framework. And that person, Aya, wants to understand what do you imply by calling it, as what do you imply with the concept scientific framework? And another is attached to that is you have similar, I think, kind of areas of study, like anti-Semitism was one of them, and also gender studies, linguistics and translation, and you can also add racism. So, when you're looking at all these areas, how do you define the concept of scientific framework? And do you also see all these areas as a work of advocacy rather than a scientific research?
Okay, well, lots of universities encourage academics to involve themselves in socially relevant activity. Doing research on Islamophobia is an obvious choice. And if you're doing research on Islamophobia, you probably want to adopt an advocacy position, which is, to defend Muslims and come up with solutions, to which I have no objection. But my worry was this, that I had an ARC grant to look at Sharia in Australia, European society, and America. And what we found in America was that despite the Supreme Court's view that legal pluralism could not exist in America, we found lots and lots of Muslim legal companies practicing Sharia advocacy, I mean, with no problem. And they were, socially mobile, upper class people. I mean, Islam was not in America, I didn't think, a kind of despised outsider position. Now, I mean, obviously the Bush administration and then Trump has made this much more problematic, but I mean, anybody that's lived in America would know that hatred of blacks and disregard for Aboriginal people is much more profound than any kind of negative view about Muslims. And I have a particular interest in the native or Aboriginal issue because I ran a research group on religion, or a discussion group on religion in New York, and I constantly try to get people to talk about Native American or Aboriginal religion, and nobody was interested. And I asked one of the professors there, why couldn't we get an interest in native religion? And his answer was, well, there ain't many of them, and they're a defeated people. So, I mean, coming from a senior professor of sociology, that was not a good start. So advocacy is fine, but I think that it kind of blinds us to positive issues like the success of Muslim communities in America. Muslim academics, very successful. Muslim legal companies are very successful. And we could have a whole discussion about Sharia, because that's another thing about difficulties of understanding. I mean, and I'll try to be short, the famous case in America when the Archbishop of Canterbury said, we're bound to have Sharia courts in Britain soon. And the next day, the popular newspaper said he'd gone crazy and he should retire and so forth. But people were confusing arbitration with courts. I mean, that was one difficulty. And I don't know, you'll have to invite me back or say, Bamier has a wonderful section on Sharia, by the way, which he spells with a lowercase s, which is interesting. And throughout he says, Sharia isn't law in the Western sense of state legal systems administered through courts responsible to the state that can, exercise a kind of compulsion in the community. And, Sharia is as much to do with civility, morality, ethical behavior practices as anything else. And I tend to agree with Bamier that Sharia has never been administered by a state in a way that Sharia is still recognizable. I mean, he's very critical of authoritarian states who use Sharia to justify all sorts of non-Muslim attitudes and practices. But I mean, it's a wonderful book. I mean, I'm going off the course. As a sociologist, I have to have some kind of notion of what looks like science, which is at the minimum accuracy to the facts that we know. Advocacy is not fake news, but it's designed to mobilize people to action. No problem with that at all. But when I write a book on happiness, I'm not trying to mobilize anybody. I might sort of make them think about unhappiness, but I don't sort of think there's going to be a social movement to make us all happy or something. So I mean, my interest in happiness is partly an outcome of my interest in vulnerability, and the interest in vulnerability is that I was a medical sociologist before I became a sociologist of religion, and so I'm kind of interested in religion from that kind of angle.
In relation to that, maybe, can I ask and that was part of the question, do you think that argument applies to racism studies, gender studies, translation? Because what is objectivity? At the end of the day, you have a positionality and every standpoint has a blind point. So how can you reject it? And in relation to that, can I also pose my question, if it's okay? My understanding in this framing is that insider is, doing advocacy, but outsider is self-evidently objective. Because even in this positionality, if a person is insider, she is expected or he is expected to acknowledge it in the research design. But if the person is outsider, the standard is normally not to mention that outsider status, so that the false, I think, perception is there. Any outsider is self-evidently objective. And that brings the question of what is objectivity. But in the meantime, I would like to get your opinion about Gramsci's organic intellectual concept. It is an intellectual growing from the I think grassroots, and is able to kind of give voice to the sentiments and and insights. So do you think that is an insider voice? And as a well-established sociologist, so how should we understand this organic intellectual concept? And also, can I just give my overall understanding of this? To me, a community, a human being, or a religion is like a palace, and you can't really understand the palace only from inside and only from outside. You need both to be able to get a complete picture. But even in that, as you said towards the end of your talk, there are always inner roads, inner rooms, inner places. Sometimes they will keep hidden, and most of people from inside and outside will not be able to know it. To me, it's like a completion together. Neither it's insider or outsider. But the problem that I saw, as I said, is not like being objective is like equal to being outsider. That's why they don't take the burden of putting their positionality or standpoint in many of the research.
Well, I don't belong to any sociological associations because I think they're all about positionality, and therefore they're not worth joining. If positionality is true, there's no point in giving this lecture. If outsiders get things wrong, then they typically get criticized by insiders who say, well, you missed this point, or you didn't really understand what this word means. And then hopefully this dialogue between inside and outside gets a better picture of what we're trying to get at. And without that kind of development, all we have is people's identity politics, you know. Unfortunately, there's no club for elderly sociologists. Otherwise, I might, you know, sort of be advocating on behalf of my club. But I don't I don't like the direction of much of sociology because I think it's all advocacy. And as I keep saying, you know, if you want to advocate on behalf of Aboriginals, terrific, and advocate on, you know, people in prison. But at the end of the day, it's not quite what I have in mind by trying to produce knowledge that's shared across, you know, different groups, different peoples, different so forth. But I mean, the essence of, it seems to me, the essence of a good science is that it's completely open to critique, you know. And therefore, I mean, nobody in their right mind thinks that Weber's account of Islam as a warrior religion is true or, you know, valid. But I mean, a lot of other things he had to say are either very interesting or important or objective, you know. So I mean, there are a lot of questions that you threw at me, but I suppose I'm saying, if we can't agree on some kind of view that the research we do has some sort of objective validity in the sense that it can be falsified by other people or shared by other people as a kind of an agreed position we could reach, then I don't know what we're doing. I mean, actually, well, this book might end by asking, what is sociology for? I don't know. I could give you some examples of where I think the objectivity things fails that I've kind of experienced in my own research. Can I just give this one? I mean, these are kind of anecdotal. With a friend, we submitted an article to a sociology journal based upon interviews with men in Birmingham, England, in which they'd expressed support for Enoch Powell, the famous controversial politician who said that, you know, migration would lead to blood flowing in the rivers of Britain and so forth. And these men felt neglected, misunderstood. No one had ever listened to their political or other views. So, I mean, they spoke very openly to us about their views, which were very controversial. The article was rejected because the reviewers said that we should have corrected the views of the people we were interviewing. And that seems to me to be the ultimate arrogance that, you know, these men whose lives are miserable basically should be instructed by, you know, professors of sociology about what their beliefs ought to be. Because we weren't doing advocacy, we were trying to find out what they thought. As a private citizen, I can say, you know, we don't want statues of Enoch Powell, thank you. But that's something different. You know. I don't think I'm going to win this argument, by the way, because I think, you know, I've given up on, perhaps I shouldn't say this, I mean, I've kind of given up on organized sociology, which seems to me to be 99.9% advocacy, and, you know, not concerned too much about anybody criticizing their position.
Yeah. Just maybe one thing about connecting Islamophobia to vulnerability and advocacy to vulnerability. Again, myself as a person doing research on Islamophobia, I have papers talking about how women's agency is asserted and how Islamophobia is used as a stepping stone. So that is obviously exactly the opposite, or accepting expecting but not accepting Islamophobia and women's somehow responses to the issue. So it is not necessarily always related to vulnerability and advocacy. But again, this is something very anecdotal based on my own experience. I would like to go to maybe Professor Raymond's question. He had also a comment there as well. Would you like to ask your question, Professor Canning?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
The first question is just the first statement is just a clarification in relation to Vatican II.
Well, this is an insider's view versus an outsider's view, right?
I'll just leave that point stand.
I mean, it's a good example. You see, if you and I had more time to have a conversation, you could correct my misunderstandings about Vatican II, and we could get to, well, I won't say quote, we could get to a more objective standpoint. And when I write about Vatican II in the future, I won't make silly mistakes. So, I mean, we're trying to move towards an objective description of what Vatican II was really about, and that I made a mistake. And that's what science ought to look like. So I'm very happy to be corrected. Okay, let's keep going.
Yeah, that's great. So there's a scope there for continuing conversation. Yeah. Really, the second point, let me try to find what I said, about the common word statement. This occurred after Pope Benedict XVI had spoken at Regensburg and had made comments that were taken badly by Muslims across the world. So he appeared to cast aspersions on Islam. The scholars, the 138 of them, responded in a very, how would I say it, sympathetic and positive way, writing a letter calling for, dialogue based on solid knowledge. Really, I suppose the question then is, how can sociology, the shred of confidence that you still have in it, as you say, be helpful in relation to that theological engagement where people of faith dialogue with each other?
Most of my reading has been through a colleague of mine who's written a lot of work on Latin America and Catholicism there. And he, along with a man called David Martin, that you may know, wrote a lot about the impact of Pentecostalism on not only Catholicism, but basically communities in Latin America. And some of the contributions of the sociologists were to point out that Pentecostalism, and this is David Martin's argument, not mine. I mean, David Martin's argument was that Pentecostalism had done a lot for the status of women in Latin American communities. And part of its attraction was that it gave Pentecostal women a sense of purpose and status and well-being in the community and so forth. And so, this was a sociological contribution to how Latin America was changing and the impact of Pentecostalism or various forms of evangelical religion on the Catholic Church itself. Theologians may well have known this. I mean, I quite often go to my local Catholic church, which I kind of like, but I don't like the Pentecostal element of it because I think I'm a kind of outsider conservative Catholic, which is a kind of oddity. But so what I'm saying is that I'm trying to give you one example that sociologists made an interesting contribution to understanding how Latin America had impacted on Catholicism as a whole through the growth of Pentecostal movements and how that had changed the status in particular of women. And there's also research, I'm sure you probably know more about it than I do, about worker priests who'd become part of what was called the base church, wasn't it? Or the base churches were politically quite critical and left-wing and so on and so forth. And that Vatican II, whatever else it was in part a response to some of those changes. So, I'm being overcritical of sociology today, but sociologists can make useful contributions. But I think we do need to make a distinction between advocating a position and being open to all the facts that may change that position through dialogue. But I think if we can't have some notion of what is shared between groups that could be called objective, then all hope is lost, really. I couldn't see the point of getting out of bed this morning if that was true. And what we've seen, of course, is, the great growth of fake news and online debates, which are awful. And what we do need is truth, because we're surrounded by, major people like presidents, peddling things that are blatantly false, his cure for COVID-19, his, views about the outside world. Trump is just one example. I'm sort of interested in Myanmar because the military there have said, it was a fake election, it was fraudulent. Now they want another election to show that they actually won, So, this is a game with truth, or, that we don't need.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. That's very helpful. We must talk again.
Yeah, well, you must explain Vatican II to me better.
We'll make a date.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you very much. We have just 6 minutes, and I see Emre's hand, and also Linda has a comment. Maybe Linda, and after that, Emre, if you can make your points or questions, so that we will give the remaining time for 6 minutes. Maybe it will be less than to Professor Turner, and we can wrap up the session then. Linda, would you like to, make your comment yourself as an activist researcher?
I just threw it onto the chat because, I position myself as an academic activist. I don't think it makes my work any less scholarly. But my belief is that all research and scholarly academic activity needs to have a social purpose. So I see advocacy as being part of that. And part of that goes back to what you said a bit earlier, Brian, when you were talking about Weber. And I think I've got this right, that you said he was one of the first sociologists interested in Islam, but he didn't really understand it. And I think that tradition continues with a lot of academics professing to support Muslims, to know about Islam and to fight against Islamophobia. But in many ways, they're perpetuating the idea of militarism and violence and colluding with the state, for example, in so-called de-radicalisation programs, which implies violence, that Islam is violent. So I think, to me, it's sort of a very complex mix that I probably can't do justice to in 1 minute of asking a question.
Well, let me just throw something in. I was the founding editor of Citizenship Studies because I think citizenship is like the essential component of solving most of our problems. And I've been writing about what I call the erosion of citizenship, namely the decline in social rights, civility, and, democratic politics and so forth. So there is I don't think I'm not activist. I try to contribute to public debate through the stuff I write, particularly around, this research on the far right. The full title is something like Intellectuals, Citizenship and Masculinity. So, it's a kind of critique of the masculinity. I'm sort of very interested in, domestic abuse in relation to masculinity and right-wing politics and so forth. And I mean, perhaps, I don't think, there's 4 of us in the research. I think the other 3 are probably into advocacy, and I don't challenge that. I think my role in the group is a little bit different, which is to, you know, to say that the history of citizenship is a very important part of the success of, you know, insofar as, well, I think Australia is a success in many ways, but I mean, it has its, you know, black history like most colonial societies. But I mean, I'm very much, I mean, I've written a lot recently on what constitutes success, you know, which is another very difficult kind of concept. Perhaps I'm sort of, you know, wedded to things that don't have easy answers. But so I don't think, I don't want to be regarded as an ivory tower guy that's not involved. I mean, I'm involved in perhaps different ways than, you know, sort of being, you know, openly activist. But I mean, the issue, I mean, with 2 other people, I've got 3 books, edited books, coming out next month on the challenge to democracy from populism, the far right, and so forth. And insofar as my stuff gets read, I mean, I'm hoping it, you know, it has an impact on what people do, think, believe, and all the rest of it. You know.
Thank you very much. Emre has something to say. I know we have only 1 minute. Emre, please jump in and make your comment in half.
I'm not. I want more time. I'm not taking the 1 minute. Sorry, but I will. Now, just in regards to Islamophobic understandings of Islam, have you come across anyone that was very Islamophobic, but over a period of time softened their stance, maybe became a little bit more understanding or empathetic? They went from being very outside to a little bit more inside-ish.
Since we've got very little time, I think the answer is no. I haven't come across people who have been easily changed from their particular views because their views are embedded in a life world. They're not just kind of abstract ideas in their heads. I mean, most people who are radical anti-Muslim don't understand the issues about migration and democracy, demographics. I mean, this argument that Muslims are replacing white people has to be seen in the context that the fertility rate of most Western, in particular, societies is well below 1. So you can't have population growth without migration. Take Japan, you know, which has the lowest migration rate and the lowest fertility rate. They have to depend upon robots for their future. And I don't think in Australia that's a sensible option. So there is hope. If we get the facts right, and the facts are not that Muslims are replacing white people, it's that white people don't have enough babies. And they don't have enough babies for various obvious reasons, that women have to go to work in order to support households. So end of story. Are you in New York, or is that just a photograph behind you?
I am in New York, Manhattan. How's that?
Are you you're still locked down? Have you had your jab?
Only for 11 months I've been inside the house.
Well,
the last time, and this is a true story, the last time I was free and walking the streets was March 15 in Sydney. I visited my mother. March 16 was lockdown. I returned to lockdown. So it's been a difficult 11 months.
Yeah.
Oh, well, good to talk to you.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks. I think biggest thanks go to, Brian Turner for making time and also making some thought-provoking points for all of us to think. This kind of conversation is just the start. Obviously, we'll continue maybe reflecting on this as academics in our writings and in our day-to-day life as well. Thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks to my co-host, Zuleyha, helping me with the questions. And I would like to end this session. And I think it was a very privilege to have listen to your webinar lecture, Professor Turner. Thank you very much. And we look forward to your edited volumes and the results of your ARC project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been very enlightening and useful. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day, afternoon.